What would you say is the threat level that we're at right now with the NHS in the UK?
I mean, I think we're in a really difficult moment with the NHS this year in particular. So, obviously, we're sort of in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. A lot of kind of pre-existing issues that were there with things like funding, waiting lists, this kind of stuff have only sort of been exacerbated by the experience of the pandemic. And we're sort of coming out the other side, and there's huge sort of red lights sort of glaring on many different metrics in the NHS at the moment, from waiting times, waiting lists, ambulance times, this kind of thing. And it obviously these things kind of get worse in the winter. Lots of people, get more sick in the winter, influenza, this kind of stuff. And there is this kind of atmosphere, I think, at the moment, in particular this year, a kind of crisis atmosphere around the NHS. And these kinds of things, very interestingly, coexist around the anniversaries of the service with a much more kind of upbeat, celebratory tone for this institution that, like you say, is beloved by many, many British people. It very regularly tops opinion polls of the things that make British people most proud to be British, ahead of the royal family and the armed forces and all these other kinds of things that you might think of. So it's very interesting kind of thinking about this moment of sort of the challenges facing the NHS at the point of an anniversary, where many people will also be kind of celebrating the NHS and the principles that lay behind it.
How does that fit into the stories we're seeing about nurse pay in Great Britain? I mean, is that the COVID effects? Is that part of why Labour on the healthcare front is bearing some of the brunt?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things that's kind of it's kind of hard to untangle from the pandemic, but again, it is a kind of pre-existing issue. So. Real wages in the UK have been pretty much stagnant since 2010, when the Conservative Party came into power. So they've been in power here for about 13 years. And wages for nurses are absolutely no exception to that. And in fact, in sort of real terms, inflation is very, very high here in the UK, higher than it is in the US, have fallen over that period. And particularly once you kind of get outside the other side of the pandemic, you're really seeing the effects of low wages for nurses in particular. Although saying that, yesterday, senior doctors also signaled that they were going to go on strike here. So this is a thing that's affecting many parts of the health service. But the nurses issue is an interesting one, because this is also happening in other countries. So in Canada, for example, this year, they had a big crisis in their emergency rooms. That was sort of partly, depending on who you ask, or mainly caused by staff shortages in things like nurses. And pay is a huge issue for nurses, I think, in many industrialized countries. I mean, but this has been the case for decades, that these are people that make a health system work on an everyday basis, and yet we simply don't pay them enough. And so the strike action that we're kind of seeing rumbling through the NHS at the moment, I think is a consequence of those workers saying that they're not going to put up with that anymore, particularly in the context of a cost of living crisis, which is going on in the UK at the moment.
In this 13 year of Conservative rule, I mean, what is the story to be told about the NHS, and what has happened during that prolonged period of the Tories holding power?
So when the Conservatives came in, they came in after 13 years of a Labour government. And during that time, NHS spending went up to its highest proportion compared to GDP of all time across that 13 years. And there were many parts of Labour's approach to the NHS, which lots of people on the left disagreed with, bringing in more private companies, this kind of stuff. But certainly on spending, it is unquestionable that that was a real improvement historically, and it really did lead to things like, you know, inpatient waiting times that were for things that were like 13 weeks when they came in. They fell to 4 weeks when they went out after that 13 years. So there were these improvements, and patient satisfaction with the service was very high. Then when the Conservatives came in, they kind of inherited this situation. Obviously, this is now the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash. There's a kind of austerity agenda that the Conservatives are driving, as are many European countries at this point. And the budget increases for the NHS across the 2010s dramatically fall compared to that prior period under the Labour Party. So there is a stark reduction in funding that's going on. So across the 2010s, NHS spending as a proportion of GDP falls, has its biggest reduction since the late 1950s. So it's very, very stark kind of reductions in those budget increases. And that has all these knock-on effects. So staff recruitment, upgrading medical buildings and facilities, all these kinds of things that obviously then when the pandemic hits, you really see the consequences of those playing out. Another important thing to mention is that the Conservative government passes a Health and Social Care Act in 2012, which basically tried to kind of open up the system to greater competition from private companies, charities, voluntary groups, sort of non-state healthcare providers. And there was a lot of anxiety at the time that this was going to be the end of the NHS, that it was going to be completely privatized. And that actually hasn't proved to be the case. There was a kind of spike in independent providers outside of the NHS getting more money after the act was passed in 2012. But actually that kind of quickly fell away. And so I suppose there, on a more optimistic note, it's not actually that simple to open up the NHS completely to private competition. It is this institution that is popular. It has a significant degree of institutional resilience. And also it has many, many defenders, of course, among the general public, but of course, thinking about trade unions, activists, campaigners who kind of went out there and resisted the, you know, what they perceived to be the harmful effects of that legislation.
And for my own edification and education on this, what does it look like to opt out and essentially go towards a private plan? How does that affect the funding mechanism for the NHS?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as a British citizen, you're entitled to free access to the NHS at any point, you know, so you don't have to kind of show an insurance card or any pay into, you know, this national insurance, which is like a small sum that you pay on your pay packet every month, but there's no kind of insurance requirement. But of course, many people choose to take out, some people I should say, choose to take out private health insurance as a way of getting treatment quicker on the NHS than the NHS could provide, or getting, you know, particularly in those kind of like high demand treatments. So things like hip surgery, for example, which is always a very in-demand surgery in an aging population. The waiting lists on the NHS are quite long, so some people will choose to kind of pay privately or take out private insurance. Historically and in recent years, the number of people that have taken out private insurance in the UK is about 10%. We don't have clear data on this at the moment, but it does seem to be the case that that more people are choosing to take out private health insurance because of the pressures on the NHS at the moment. But usually what you see is that people will do a bit of a mix. So they'll go to their local NHS doctor if they've got a cold or if their kid's ill or whatever it is. And then if there's a kind of procedure that they want done that, you know, has a kind of high waiting list on the NHS, they'll pay for it privately and get insurance out for that. So it's kind of a bit of a mix. But we have seen, again, just maybe strike a slightly more optimistic note, we've seen these kinds of spikes before in the NHS's history in private health insurance uptake. But once the pressures on the NHS have been relieved, so I mentioned that Labour period between 1997 and 2010, there was again kind of rising uptake of private health insurance before that because of all the pressures under Conservative rule before Labour came back in. Once Labour got back in, the private health insurance numbers of people getting that actually fell. So again, we've got a general election here next year. It might be the case that if the Labour Party win, and the opinion polls suggest that they will, although you can never count on that, it might be the case that if they get back in and the funding goes back up and there's reform, that private health insurance might become less important.